We're live, ladies and gentlemen. How do you do, folks? Nice to see you. My name is Dustin Cormier, and welcome to How to Rock Astrology. Today, we are continuing our series talking about Saturn through Astrology Karma and Transformation by Stephen Arroyo. Been hanging out on chapter 5 of the book, and now we've gotten to, in a lot of ways, what's the heart of this book, which is in a lot of ways the heart of dealing with Saturn. And this is Saturn's transit through the houses. Today we're talking about Saturn transiting the first house, the Ascendant, the rising sign, as well as Saturn, more particularly, the things that we read in this transit are going to be most heavily implicated when Saturn is transiting within 6 degrees of the Ascendant, the Lagna, the rising sign. So the first thing I want to do with these readings, we've really been talking a lot about Saturn throughout this series. If you want to know more about Saturn transiting the houses in general, what these transits mean, how you can interpret them, feel free to check out the earlier part of this series where just like 1 or 2 videos ago we were talking about that. Today we're talking about the first house. So what I want to start with first is just a little bit of a rundown of what that first house means. Just a few key concepts. This first bit comes from The Art and Science of Vedic Astrology by RYAN KURCZAK'S. This is a Western reading, but I always like to add a little bit of every possible cross-cultural reference that I can give to the nature of the houses. The first house has an affinity with Aries and Mars because of the relation of the first sign, Aries, impulsiveness, etc. The key words are the body and self-projection in the Vedic sense. The first house relates to the body, especially to the head, and also to the ego and self-awareness. The first house is a Kona house, which is basically one of the trinal houses. The first, the fifth, and the ninth being the trinal houses, and being the most important houses in a chart, in anyone's chart, truly. Now, what I want to say here is that keep in mind, whenever we read about transits to Saturn, we also are talking about we can be talking about the lord of a house. For example, the sign that rules, the planet that rules the sign where the ascendant cusp falls. If Saturn transits that planet within 6 degrees, it's going to give you similar themes related to first house Saturn transits. Because the first house is carried, the first house, the Ascendant, is carried by the planet ruling the sign that it falls into. So if Saturn transits there, we can also read this and get something out of that. I'll try to say that earlier in the video next time. Now this next little bit's a quick little roundup on the first house again. It's Astrology, Cosmic Science by Isabel Hickey. So just a little, what is the first house all about? It's about what you look like. It's the personal self. Its chief characteristic is action. It's destiny in the making. And Saturn coming through here is going to help us come to grips with this destiny in the making of ourselves, of what we inherently are in all ways, beings, and places. The first house represents the present. It defines the personality, and appearance, disposition, and the manner. The first house does relate to our outlook on life, and it's the window through which you view the world, the reactiveness of the rising sign. So for Saturn to come through the first house, it can be a difficult thing because Saturn actually does better once it's on the touching the 7th house cusp, and going past there is a much more enjoyable experience than Saturn going through the first house. In Vedic astrology, we actually say that Saturn being in the first house, it loses Digbala, directional strength. So Saturn, we have a hard time when Saturn comes through the first house, but really what defines whether all of this stuff related to your body, related to your identity, your spontaneous personality and expression, when Saturn transits this first house, it depends on the health of your first house. If you have benefic planets there in the sign that's holding your first house, and if the first house lord, again, the planet ruling the sign that the ascendant falls into, the ascendant cusp, if that planet is doing well, then Saturn transiting the first house will be a good, you'll get rewarded, it'll be tough and you'll endure, but there will be a very positive, satisfying end to Saturn transiting the first house. So for example, I'm a Leo rising, and my sun is in Scorpio. It's in the fourth house, which isn't great, but it's with Mars. Mars is doing well, although it's combust the sun. I could talk about my own thing, but since I'm a Leo rising, the health and the strength of my sun, if it's strong, if it's close to the 10th house cusp, if it has positive aspects from benefic planets like Venus or the moon, or especially Jupiter, and even like Mars, its friend, then this will be a strong sun. It'll be, if it's good by sign dignity, then it'll have the capacity to take the pressure of Saturn, and it will have the resources and strength and capacity to wring out the best of what that planet represents, of what that cusp represents. This being the ascendant cusp, the first house. So when Saturn is coming through the first house, if the planet ruling your first house, the ascendant lord, is well placed, then this Saturn transiting that cusp will be a good time. It'll be good for the body. You'll learn necessary things about the body. And these are the kind of things that you got to think about. You got to think about the houses as being carried by the planets. Now, the first house relates to our being born in the world. It is the birth through which we came into this world. Saturn coming here and constricting things has a lot of tough implications about how we understand ourselves. We might have pressure from the world outside of us. Saturn's opposite in the first house being the 7th house. Others might cause pressure on us, and this causes us to spontaneously erupt with that which we truly are and want to be. Or on the other hand, we might be in a place, that would be us being constricted in our personality, only to emerge with a personality that can be integrated with others, but is newly, freshly itself. It's the kind of experience you might be having with Saturn coming through this first house. Now, I've been really giving a lot of my own spiel here. The point of these videos is to finally get here. This is Astrology Karma and Transformation by Stephen Arroyo, talking about the transits of Saturn, here being the transit of Saturn through the first house, through your ascendant cusp, or passing through the first house lord. Stephen Arroyo says, as Saturn transits the first house, a new order is being created after the old order was dissolved while Saturn was in house number 12. Stephen Arroyo talks about the houses being a constant cyclical progression. And if you had read from Saturn in the 10th, 11th, and 12th in our coming videos, you would come back to here and you would notice that it's a seamless tram. So, as Saturn transits this house, a new order is being created after the old order was dissolved while Saturn was in the 12th house. As Saturn approaches and then it conjuncts the ascendant, you often experience something that brings you down to earth, that makes you realize the results of your actions and past behavior patterns, and hence that can prompt you to take more responsibility for yourself and your actions than has been the case in the past. Usually, some outer circumstance compels you to face up to important immediate facts or situations that have been perhaps neglected or taken for granted in the past. This sort of experience is the beginning of a long phase of coming to realize some practical truths about yourself. Since most people are more aware of their faults and needs for future development at this time, it is often a period when one actively seeks feedback from others in order to get a clearer picture of what and who one truly is. One may seek this feedback from friends, but it often takes the form of legitimately going to a counselor, a psychiatrist, an astrologer, or some other kind of therapist, an Akashic record reader, what have you. In short, it is a period of becoming more realistic about yourself, of trying to get a perspective on what kind of you want to create, and of beginning to build this new you through concentrated effort and honest self-appraisal. One thing I would like to say is that I really deeply got an inkling that yoga is an important thing to me when Saturn long ago was transiting Leo, which is my ascendant, my first house. I never would have realized how important yoga would be for me personally, as a Leo, I guess, until Saturn came through my first house. I recommend anybody who is having a first house Saturn transit experience to consider yoga as something to be a useful ground, physical yoga, as well as meditation, which is really the heart of yoga. What I mean to say is that Hatha yoga is actually useful as a first house Saturn transit vessel to help you loosen up and get rid of the old neurological samskaras that are holding your somatotype, your actual physical body, from birthing beyond the walls that have been given to this physical experience that you've had so far. The first house is our physical body on Earth. It is the representation of Earth in the cosmic schema. And so the Lagna, the rising sign, holds and shows and is our physical body, our physical life path, to which all things in the physical world kind of spin, our actual physical gravity through which we attract what our reality is. And our mind and our body are one. So that's why I deeply recommend, if you're going through a Saturn first house experience, consider yoga, the opening, the very subsistent, consistent, patient opening of the somatotype, of the body, of the byways of the body, of the actual very subtle crystallization of tendons, of joints, and especially of the pliability of the spine and the back. These are all things that we would almost do in an embryonic state before we're born. Consider Saturn in the 12th as a good isolating retreat time for building and developing on new bodily freedoms and expression. So when we're finally born, we have a capable body that is newly connected to its neuroplasticity, that has neuroplasticity. Because an open body has the neuroplasticity that reflects as an open mind. Something very deeply to consider when you're going through a Saturn first house transit. Saturn transiting the first house is a period of paying attention to yourself with considerable seriousness. A time when you can begin to know yourself more deeply than ever before, and a time to learn more about your individual capabilities. Saturn's transit through both the 12th and the first houses is often a period of personal crisis, a rebirth process which can last over 5 years. It's a good time for spiritual retreat, in my opinion. During that entire period, the old personality structure is irretrievably left behind, but the new kind of new structure and the new way that you will approach life and express yourself is largely dependent upon the level of honesty with which you confront yourself at this time. Again, it's like this is the how honestly, earnestly, and comfortably are you going to shake the rattle that is your spirit self and soul? Because however you do it in the womb is how you're going to do it after you emerge from the womb of Saturn in this 12th house, in this first house. It is my feeling that the entire period when Saturn is in the 12th and the first houses should be viewed as comprising one of the major transition phases in anyone's life. And therefore, it is advisable to relate the meaning of Saturn in the first house to Saturn's transit of the 12th house, rather than seeing each phase as an isolated time period. They're both kind of one and the same. And I should also say, even if you've been born and you have Saturn like in your first house, you are acting very deeply on the 12th house past life of your past life. And it's just an interesting thing to think of with someone actually having Saturn, being born with Saturn in their first house. Because there's a intrinsic gluedness of any point in a chart with the 12th house from that point. You can even say that, like the 5th house is deeply integrated as the root foundation upon which the 6th house can express and apply itself, right? And the 4th is that for the 5th, and the 3rd is that for the 4th. It just shows the oneness of it all. I mean, I guess you could say that about anything. You can make it all undiscerning and just say it's all one. But in this case, he's saying in particular that you can't really judge the expression of the first house, Saturn transiting the first house, without relating it to what happened when Saturn was transiting the 12th house. If you, as an astrological counselor, if you went to if a client comes to you for the first time and says, hey, I've got Saturn in the first house and it's mucking me up, can you tell me all about it? You as an astrological counselor are going to say, great, well, how is your Saturn in your 12th? Was it crappy? Good, because not good, but let's figure out why. Because if we don't figure out why, guess how your Saturn transiting the first house is going to be. You can't polish a turd, The mean way to say it. It's a musical term. But on the other hand, if you went through the 12th house and a person says, hey, I'm just asking you about astrology, and the person gives you their ascendant, and you see that their Saturn is presently transiting their first house. But they aren't here with any problems. They're just in an open place of new opportunity. Astrologer. I've never seen an astrologer before, so what's it all about? What's it like? And you ask the person, well, how is the last 2.5 years when Saturn was transiting your 12th? And they say, a whole new period of new progression and new identity. I want to be a whole new person, and I'm excited about it, but I don't know. That could be very new age, hippy-dippy. It's all like too much optimism and, Neptunian vibrations of a whole new age energy. You don't want to suck into that. But if the person is saying that they had a good experience for the last 2.5 and they're having a good experience now, then you could say that it was because of the 12th house that they're pouring in with a good root and foundation for this new transformative state. This new dissolving, reaffirming foundation of the personality that's happening in the first house. So just consider the first in context with the 12th as well as with the rest of the chart. This is an important part of any person's life. I'm just checking my comments here. Cool. My friend called me Mira. My Scorpio sun is in the 4th house also. Just checking out our comments here. So thanks for watching. Call me Mira and CJ. As usual, this is a live stream, so anybody who has questions, comments, feel free to ask about them, and I'll see if I can speak to them. Now, sorry, not to interrupt. Let's continue. The expression getting it together is an apt one for describing Saturn in the first house. For, as Saturn leaves the 12th house, the individual often feels like a newborn child, open to everything, endlessly curious, but also without much discipline or definite structure in the personality. The new potentials that appeared during the 12th house phase are not as yet integrated into a coherent, functional whole. Might have just been like, what's it like after the person falls out of their interaction with the world from the 10th and 11th, and now the person has dealt enough with responsibilities in the world, they haven't looked at themselves, because Saturn's been transiting the 10th and the 11th. Now it's in the 12th, and the person's exhausted their worldly energy, and they're slipping back into themselves when Saturn's transiting the 12th, and that's when they go on retreats, or something happens where you're forced and you're having a nervous breakdown or something like that, or loss or what have you, to re-examine your life while Saturn comes through the 12th. So as Saturn enters the first house, you often feel the need to become something, to work actively at developing yourself, rather than remaining in the open but passive state of being symbolized by the 12th house. One then often puts in considerable effort to mold a new sense of identity, a new, deeper level of confidence. And often, as Saturn gets toward the end of the first house, one will have an experience or will meet someone who leads one toward the experience of realizing one's wholeness with heightened clarity. This new feeling of being integrated and inwardly strong is based on a deeper sense of enduring values and on a greater sense of one's personal responsibilities and essential individuality. This is what I was basically trying to get at with Saturn having transited the 12th. The energies of the 10th and the 11th have been exhausted for the last little bit. Now they've spent so much energy out in the world, it forces us, when Saturn transits our 12th, to just let go, to rest, to seek inwardly. And it's in the Saturn in the 12th mystical kind of phase where we can have experiences that really grip whether the whole Saturn going through its whole process has worked out for us so far. If all of the physical energy, the mental, the emotional, the spiritual roots and their expression have found their proper place so that we can rest blissfully in the 12th house of retreat. Is all of it working? Is some of it not working? What's obstructing us? It's the internal realization that is forced out of us in the 12th that brings on the feeling of want to become something out of it, to come out of that nebulous womb and reach into the world with some kind of identity, a slot, a role, a personality intact that can be actually used in the world. And this new feeling of being integrated and inwardly strong is based on a deeper sense of enduring values that relate to the self, not just one's job or fads or trends, but on a greater sense of one's personal responsibilities and essential individuality. This is a reckoning of the whole chart, of all the houses as Saturn passes this point. While Saturn crosses the Ascendant and remains in the first house, often there are also marked physical changes. Losing weight effortlessly is common, occasionally even to the point of looking emaciated. The physical energy is often quite low, manifesting as tiredness, poor digestion, and at times feelings of depression. However, one should realize that this is the period of maximum opportunity for building a new body as well as a new personality, hence the physical Hatha Yoga. Hopefully, ultimately, is a route to something deeper than that, but even that for its own sake. First house, physical body cleanup. But that building takes discipline, perseverance, and lots of work. I have seen robust and healthy people waste away to nothingness during this transit if they took no steps towards improving their health habits and disciplining their living and eating patterns. But I've also witnessed weak and sickly people begin a health regimen during this period, which resulted in their achieving a state of excellent health and abundant energy even before Saturn left the first house. It's almost like they needed the Saturn coming through the first. They've been sickly for a long time. They needed Saturn in the first to hit rock bottom, and now it's like, I can't go any further than this, but I feel like not dying, so I have to, like, this will kill me if I keep going any further than this. So I might as well just start floating back up. It's that rock bottom experience that often brings people out of a physical body disconnection. Obviously, the disconnection is what brought them to rock bottom, and it just about kills them sometimes if anybody has problems with the 6th house as well as the 1st house and is having this Saturn in the 1st house transit. In other words, Saturn's transit of the 1st house can be considered to be the key phase of the Saturn cycle, for it is during this period of life that we are, in effect, creating the kind of person that we want to be and realizing what kind of person our karma demands that we be. That's a good way to put it. Therefore, all of one's activities and involvements in the outer world during the rest of the 29-year cycle will grow directly from the values that one commits oneself to and from the sort of character that is built during this period. Saturn's transit of the 1st house can indeed be considered a period of obscurity in the sense that one is paying attention to So Saturn's transit of the 1st house can indeed be considered a period of obscurity in the sense that one is paying attention primarily to oneself during this time, rather than actively engaging in major involvements and ambitions that would be readily noticed by the public. Though there are some exceptions to this, as I said at the start, where you're so pressured by the public to do something that you're forced to have an ecstatic self-retreat within yourself. But it is, of course, almost always necessary that one turn within oneself and withdraw, to some extent, from involvements in the outer world during any period of marked personal transformation and quickened growth. Personal retreat is good when you're dealing with any level of personal transformation. But it is, of course, almost always necessary that one... we just said that. It should also be pointed out that it is fairly common for the person to begin working at some study, interest, or long-term goal at this time, which will eventually grow into a full-time vocation or major ambition. For the planet of ambition and career, Saturn, is in the house of new beginnings, the 1st house. It's an interesting point. What once were the person's major ambitions and long-term goals usually collapse or are seen to be empty while Saturn is in the 12th house, whereas new goals and vocational interests begin to take form as Saturn transits the 1st house. The person often does not realize that these new interests will have such an important part to play in the major activities of later years. Yet the individual often seems to be guided towards specific types of work at this time, even if he or she feels a definite resistance to pursuing such activities. After all, Saturn is often felt as the hand of destiny reaching into our lives, and this is just one more instance of it playing that role in defining our future orientation. And as we go through the rest of the Saturn transiting the houses, we're going to see how the seed that's laid here begins to unfold, manifest, flower, kind of in a way in the 7th, and really its fruit is revealed when Saturn comes above the horizon, past the 7th into the 8th and 9th, and eventually the 10th. And it's at its fullest expression. The seed of the intention laid in the first, when Saturn was transiting the 1st house, finds its fullest worldly expression and acceptance, and when Saturn comes around and transits the 10th, probably like 21 years later. And then the final 7 years, Saturn falls from the 10th back into the 12th, where again it begins this cycle of discerning what in that whole cycle was worth following, was worth evading, was not worth following, that I shouldn't have avoided. And it begins to do this new first house reorientation of the whole cycle again for the next one. Very fascinating stuff. Saturn transiting the first is a very important transit. And I'm glad that I got to transmit this particular reading of it to you guys. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. That was Saturn transiting the first house. It's a lot to be thought of in that regard, the newness and everything. If you enjoyed the language that I used, of course, feel free to watch the rest of this series where I talk about more things related to Saturn, as well as even to the transits of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Pluto in the houses was a particular series that we did a little bit back there. If you want to know more about these aspects of Saturn, check out the earlier parts of this series where we talked about Saturn in aspect and through the houses and all that stuff. Like, comment, subscribe if you guys enjoyed. We always got more stuff coming out. Stay tuned because we've got more live stuff coming in the next weeks to come every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Thanks for watching, folks. I'm Dustin Cormier. I'll see you guys on the next one. For those watching live, feel free to keep watching because we're going to pour into Saturn in the second house. I can see my friend Mary Grace, MG, is saying hello as well. I don't know if you're still watching, MG, but hi. I'm glad you popped in. Feel free to hang around with me, pal, and make any